the State Secretary will join us through his mobile phone. We will then open the discussion to the expert panel. We are very honored that a group of highly eminent experts from all over Europe followed our invitation. We have sent a list of all registered participants in advance so that you also can see who is in the audience. I also want to welcome all other guests who are participating today in the audience. Unlike in the analog world, unfortunately, we cannot make you visible and audible during the online seminars. But we will invite you in the course of the event to ask questions through the Q&A section. Before we start, let me mention also two technical points. First, as announced during the event registration, the meeting will be recorded, and following the meeting, it will be uploaded to YouTube so that it's also accessible to a wider audience. Second, if you're a speaker or discussant, please do not forget to unmute yourself before you are speaking. And once you are done speaking, remember to mute yourself again. Thanks a lot. Ladies and gentlemen, demographic change, social inequality, and equity of living conditions and social cohesion, these are just some of the future challenges of our societies and democracies that have been somewhat pushed into the background of the public interest during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, these issues are still, perhaps more than ever, relevant for our future. And they will also be relevant if you talk about other crises which may come up in the future. So we are not only talking about demographic change, social inequality, the equity of living conditions, and social cohesion today, but also about resilience, meaning how the population or individuals can better overcome crisis. The recent crisis, the follow-up of this crisis, and maybe future crisis. Politicians have addressed these social and demographic issues very intensively for many years. The importance of the topic is also underlined by the fact that the European Commission, since 2019, has its own Vice President for Democracy and Demography, Dubravka Šuica. The topics that interest us today in our meeting are, as you can see, high on the political agenda, not only in Germany, but also in Europe and even outside of our region. In view of what's currently going on, for instance, in the United States, one could say that securing social cohesion in a population which is growing diverse has become a future challenge for any society or democracy worldwide. As you can see, all these aspects have both a strong political and social science dimension. We are therefore very happy to have two outstanding representatives from politics and science on the panel, Dr. Markus Kerber and Professor Arnstein Aassve. Dr. Markus Kerber is the State Secretary in the German Federal Ministry of the Interior, Building and Community. Dr. Arnstein Aassve is Professor in Demography at the Department of Policy Analysis and Public Management of Bocconi University in Milan, one of Italy's leading universities. Again, thank you both for joining us today. And now let's move to the first part of our discussion. Let me first ask the State Secretary whether he's connected now with his mobile phone. I hope he's now with us. Otherwise, I would start my question to Arnstein. Herr Staatssekretär, sind Sie online? Not yet, so we have to go for the first question to Arnstein. Arnstein, in recent years, population researchers have also strongly taken up all these topics which we just mentioned. One could even speak somehow of a renaissance of demography, which at least in Germany has literally led an existence in the shadows for quite a long time and has flourished particularly during the previous 2 decades. Given your experience of the last years, and especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, if you could set up a large research program, which topics and which research needs would you primarily address and put a stronger emphasis on?
Thank you very much. Let me first say thank you for organizing this webinar. It's a great possibility or opportunity for us scientists to meet the policymakers. Coming to your question, let me give a few sort of setting the stage a bit. One of the things that also demographers have been doing a better job in over the last few decades is really to bring in the issue of policy and also emphasize issues of how policies can have an impact across Europe, where there are different cultural aspects, different cultural ideas, and so on. And it's also clear that a policy doesn't always work for all backgrounds. I think in this webinar, you're going to take up a few very important issues, which we are starting to deal with, things like resilience, as you say. And I think resilience is a particularly interesting issue. And if I was going to set up a research project that was innovative, I think it would be very interesting to look much deeper into resilience and to what extent that has an impact on demographic change and the demographic patterns that we see across Europe. And one of the things that we know from resilience, for instance, is that education matters a lot. So those with higher education, they have stronger resilience, meaning that when there is a crisis, they are better able to cope with it and get through it. But even if you, in an analysis controlled for education, one of the things that you find is that there is huge differences across countries nevertheless. So it's not only about education, and that if I was going to look into this and people were willing to give me research funds for this, then I would try to understand what is it that brings about resilience in people, and what kind of effect is it going to have on our demographic change? And you might be, for this audience, you might be interested to know, for instance, if you look at the correlation between resilience at an average level across countries and fertility rates, you're going to find a correlation around 0.4. And that's pretty high. Of course, you don't know the mechanism, in the sense that you don't know which way it goes. Perhaps those with many children are becoming more resilient. Maybe it's the other way, that those who are resilient are going to have more children, for instance. But resilience also correlates with things like policies, such as childcare, kindergartens, so the provision of childcare. So I think this is webinar is great for that, in the sense that we are touching on things like social cohesion, resilience, and demographic change. And I do think that resilience would matter quite a lot. You need to unmute yourself, Andreas.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot. You raised a lot of very interesting and important points. Let me now welcome very warmly Dr. Markus Kerber, the State Secretary of the German Ministry of the Interior. It's very nicely, many thanks that you join us today. We are already starting a little bit into digging into this field, and if you like, I would bring you immediately into the discussion. First of all, I hope we are connected and we can hear each other.
I hope you can hear me and see me.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's perfect. Fine. Thanks a lot for joining us today. State Secretary Kerber, during the current crisis, in the recent years, the federal government made the issues which we are talking today a high priority. So social cohesion, demographic change, social coherence, and the like. There was a large number of events. A year of science on demographic change. The German government launched a demography strategy. We had interministerial commissions. If you would like to review your experiences since the publication of the demography strategy, especially perhaps your experiences during the COVID year 2020, would you possibly want to set different or new focal points in the next few years, what would you see as the most important focus of the demography-related policy agenda on your side?
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to dwell a little bit upon this really important topic. The most outstanding fact for me over the last 8 years, we did launch our demography strategy in 2012 against a certain expectation, i.e. a declining overall population in Germany, given the geographic trends of overaging and a low fertility rate that we had seen in the years 2000 to 2010 as a continuation of earlier trends from the 90s. So when we launched our demographic strategy, we were still thinking that the German population would be continuing its trend from erstwhile 82 million over 79 million to 76 or maybe 75 million. Surprise, surprise, things did not go as we thought they would develop. We're now looking at a population of at least 83 million. So higher, not lower. All our planning expectations were overrun by reality. And there are two main reasons for that. The first reason being intra-European migration. In a way, the single market, in all our expectations that we had for European Union and for European development, had overshot. Migration in Europe from Spain to Germany, from Greece to UK, from Denmark to, I don't know, France. It's all a lot more dynamic than we initially thought. And Germany, with its relatively strong and healthy economy, and its wide range of cities and regions, has become a magnet for intra-European population movements. And of course, the second influx was then in 2015, 2016, the large number of refugees adding at least 1 million, if not more, to our population. So in a nutshell, and as a third trend, fertility rate has risen from 1.3 to roughly 1.55 per woman or per female. And these are three amazing and surprising developments, because although we had planned for demographic change, we had somewhat misplanned. We're now faced with the situation that some of the consequences of the assumptions in the demographic field are to be corrected. People want more housing, not less housing. They want more government, more hospitals, more schools, more civil servants, and we do actually need them than we initially thought a decade or 1.5 decades ago. And we somehow have to see whether we can get the country into a sideways move rather in an upwards move, because we think that the migration into Germany that we have witnessed is a permanent one. People will want to settle down and basically change the society. Having said that, Germany cannot in itself isolate itself from the overall demographic trends that we have in Europe. So within the surprising change of our population, we still see the same patterns that we may have to come back later on, which is we have a clear east-west divide, we have a north-south divide, both in life expectancy and in the directions where people want to move. We still have a relatively, overall speaking, a relatively overaged population, less so than we assumed in the worst case, but still within the European lines, and we cannot compare ourselves to dynamic and younger populations of Asia or Africa. But in a nutshell, we're different, and yet we're in line with most other European countries, and we share the burden and we share the strategies of all our European friends and neighbors. Coming to COVID, I think COVID again changes the banter quite dramatically. We have still relatively low fertility rates. We surpassed 20,000 as we speak yesterday. But we have, of course, the same trend that we see in other countries too. 96 or 95% of those who have died of COVID or a COVID-related infection are in the upper age bracket, so they're 65 or older. What we do not know is the effects of long COVID. All the younger people that may get an infection, we have now roughly 1.3 million people infected out of 83 million, but numbers are rising. If the trend that we see in the UK and the US, if the trend holds true for Germany, and we have roughly 6, 7, or 8% of those who have an infection and survived it, will still have to fight with longer term problems, health problems, that will have a huge, I think, impact on our health system, on the economic system. And it's interesting to see how little we know so far about long COVID, which could be in the end the bigger threat than the fertility rate in terms of economic damages. And the third and last point, and it relates to the resilience point, is the psychological effects and the psychological damages of a pandemic that Europe hasn't witnessed for 100 years. And like all our European friends and neighbors, we have the same problems here, more psychological problems, a very tense problem with cohesion. We have a very influential and vociferous, let's not say influential, but a very loud, noisy, vociferous anti-government movement in the social media and sometimes in the streets, anti-vaccination, anti-lockdown, anti-COVID measures, up to the point where people are claiming that COVID doesn't really exist, that it's a conspiracy theory to inhibit individual freedoms. And it's a clear and marked attempt to undermine the stability in our society. And a last and very peripheral point, in this group of scientists, but being the man I am in the Ministry of the Interior, we do also see, or we have certain suspicions that state actors from outside the European Union are launching a huge disinformation campaign when it comes to vaccinations in Europe, in order to prevent us from becoming immune in the speed that we would need to, in order to destabilize and subvert our societies, our cohesion, and of course, cause lasting damage on our economy. So it is a serious, invisible impact rather than one that we see in the statistics or in the fertility rates. Maybe as a starter and very broadly speaking.
That was very interesting point. Let me just come back to that, because really social cohesion, it's a big fear among the population, also among experts, that social cohesion is really endangered. I absolutely agree to you. We have really people who protested a lot, who demonstrated against the restrictions, who ignored the rules, sometimes as a matter of disinterest, sometimes deliberately even. And as you said, I mean, we have also this discussions of growing radicalism, aggressiveness, and also conspiracy theory. On the other side, we have also, during the current crisis, strong signs of social cohesion. People have helped older neighbors. They started really to take care for people who are living in their houses. I'm living in Berlin, and I can tell you, it's really in our house, has got much better with social cohesion. There was a growing appreciation for people who work in social institutions and in the healthcare sector. And we have also high acceptance, actually, if you look on the average of the population, of the necessary measures which have to be taken against the epidemic, even if they often severely restrict our life. But what, from your policy perspective, what can we do? How can we deal with the fact of this polarization? It seems it has to be increased within our society, and that our society might be at risk to fall apart. What can we do from a policy perspective against that?
I mean, let me start with one of the theories that we apply, or assumptions that we apply to our policies here in the Ministry of the Interior. I think the pandemic only exacerbates underlying fears and disorientations that we had in all our Western societies. And I think it has to do with the fact that against the assumptions of Francis Fukuyama in the 1990s, history has not ended. Europe is not, and our Western market-based democratic system is not the only social order in which people live around this globe. So we're back to systemic competition, not necessarily ideological competition, but our way of living in Europe and in other Western countries is not automatically adapted by the rest of the world, as we all assumed in the 1990s. So an interregnum has come to an end, and it deeply alienates and disorients people, especially the younger they are, who have grown up with the assumption that this is it and we shall live peacefully forever. And in this world of disorientation, the pandemic is a catalyst for even more insecureness, and people are looking for explanations. And if there is a lack of political narratives, if there is a lack of political far-reaching narratives, then the people who have narratives, even though that they're stupid and totally nonsensical, like the ones from the populists, are in demand. Brings me to the answer to your question. I think we have to reorient as governments. We have to be helpful in reorient civil society for more than a quarter of a year or for more than one legislative period. People want to see where we are going. What is the future of Europe? What is our role model in the world? And I think that's more than facts, numbers, and figures. It's more than GDP. It's more than the usual rooster of numbers and key performance indicators that you and I and everyone else around the phone deals with in his daily life. The people in the streets in Europe want more than just numbers and figures. They want to know, where do we stand in the world? What's our way forward? Where will we be in 2050? And if you allow me that one personal comment, when it comes to 2050, for the man in the street, we only have a very dystopic, almost totally negative narrative, which is climate change will sort of eradicate us from the planet in 2050 if we do not do the following things. That narrative has to be there, but on top of it, there needs to be a positive. If we reach to that point, then the world will be a better one. And I think the positive future is missing in the European narrative. At the moment, it's a very, if we don't do this, the ship will sink narrative. It's not enough. It's not enough. And therefore, and I take your point, living in Berlin as well, very seriously. You're absolutely right. What we see in the micro-sociological field is that a lot of people are coming together. Maybe we should reward them more. Maybe we should acknowledge what they are doing. Maybe we should let them know that they are actually the basis of our society. It's not government in itself, but we appreciate what they're doing. And I think they're doing a lot. Cross-generational, I think what we see cross-ethnic groups in Berlin and other cities as well is very, very promising. And it shows that the open society works. And if we acknowledge that, then a certain optimism and a certain resilience, as the psychologist would say, re-emerges in our society. It's a little bit long, but I'm sorry. The question was a very difficult one.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more to your suggestion that we should create a new narrative. And if you see how the situation looks like outside of Europe, the damage of the pandemic, the way how the states and the social systems deal with the pandemic, I think the European model, welfare state model, has proved as being definitely the better equipped in order to solve for such a situation. We should perhaps put a bit more enthusiasm on that. You mentioned also the diversity management, which you also have to think about it. And this brings me to a question to Arnstein. Demographers are dealing actually with growing population diversity in terms of ethnic background, education attainment, as you mentioned already in your first statement, socioeconomic status, family structures, health, and other characteristics. What role do you think is this growing population diversity playing and will play in the future in maintaining social cohesion?
So I think, so if I may, if I could come back and just before I answer that, to come back to the previous point being made, I think I just wanted to put a slightly more optimistic slant on what was being said about the current COVID crisis and so on. I think that there is quite a difference between the current COVID crisis and the previous one that we had, the economic downturn in 2008. And in that case, I think that it was kind of economically and politically driven. And what happened there is that banks got bailed out, whereas the ordinary person in the street ended up exposed to austerity. And I think that that brought about a lot of discontent and certainly gave rise to the populism that we saw in the ensuing years. Now, the COVID is a little bit different, despite the fact that it's much more severe. It is nevertheless a little bit different because it is not it's not viewed as something that is, let's say, created or coming from an economic elite or a political elite. And what I see, for instance, is even the EU, the Commission, being able to bring about some more positive thoughts about it. When we look at recent data coming back to March, April, when the EU was lagging behind a little bit in order to come up with the rescue package, the recovery fund, now entitled or labeled Next Generation EU, what you saw is that there was quite a lot of distrust to the EU. When you come to July, when they agreed on the package, actually what you see in many countries that traditionally were more, let's say, suspicious to the EU, the level of trust to the EU increased substantially. So I think that there is, scope for some. So what I see is that this crisis does not necessarily make social cohesion a lot worse. Perhaps the problem with social cohesion was already there and could have been an aftermath after the 2008 economic recession. But it's early to tell. You know, it's still not over, and luckily we got technology, and with it comes vaccine. But there's going to be big structural changes coming about, and many of them going to be permanent. So I think it is a lot of responsibility that lies on politicians and political leaders in order to ride out the storm, so to speak. But coming back, sorry for rambling on that, but you asked a very specific question, and I think indeed, as the Secretary of State mentioned, the issue of migration and permanent immigration, low fertility, the older population suffering from COVID, the young generation, you know, the unluckiest generation, those who were coming out of the economic recession as young adults, now they're going to start family life in their early 30s, perhaps the unluckiest generation in a very long time. I think that there are short-term policies that you need to sort of come up with. But at the same time, there are some more fundamental, deep policies that you need to think about. And here it's really services, public services that I think one needs to think carefully about. And consistent with the view of the State Secretary, you need to have a long-term perspective on it. That's difficult in sort of the political climate in many countries. But if you look across Europe, you will see examples where long-running policies really had a very good impact on demographic change. You know, the Nordic countries come up as an example, where you have, let's say, a very strong coverage for childcare, universal childcare, which has a lot of very good features about it, not least thinking about immigrants and the children of immigrants coming to new countries. If there is universal childcare, at least the children of the immigrants are going to be much better prepared and able to cope in as they grow up, and that will have a lot of good outcomes associated with it. You know, but also universal public childcare, for instance, might have very other good consequences. You know, it could bring about better gender equality. It could bring about higher rates of female labor force participation and so on, which in the end might be also very good for economic prosperity. The issue is, of course, you know, despite the good examples of the Nordic welfare states, you know, why doesn't it happen elsewhere? Why is it not followed? And here, of course, long-standing cultural ideas hold back policy change.
Thanks a lot. This was a very rich opening of the debate. I have a number of questions which I could now pose to you, but I don't want to take too much of the floor because we have so many eminent experts in the room, and I would like to ask them now to join the debate with their questions and comments. So if you want to take the floor, just click on the chat button and write down your name in the chat room. And I would ask you to unmute yourself then in order to offer appearance. And if you take the floor, please shortly introduce yourself and please keep your interventions short. I think I have already one comment here. One is Herr Müller-Hofstede. Would you like to take the floor?
Yeah, thanks. I'm just trying to pitch a little bit of information about our work here. I'm representing the Federal Agency for Civic Education, and in particular representing my boss, Thomas Krüger, the director of the agency, in this meeting, and hope I can bring back all the information we can get out from this meeting. Thanks so much for inviting me and us to that high-level expert panel. And I think the idea of citizenship education was not mentioned explicitly here, but if you look at the conversation we just had in the past 30 minutes, I think the basic need for more and better citizenship education as a profession, which has been established as a rich field, so to say, in Germany, but also in other countries, in other European countries and even East European countries, you find little but quite strong initiatives for citizenship education in order really to enable citizens to cope with the global challenges we just discussed. And I think citizenship education needs to be understood in a very broad sense, not as a narrow academic discipline of some teachers who are teaching politics 1 hour a week or so, but it has to be looked at in a very global perspective as fostering basically capacities of citizens to participate in societies and democracy. In particular, and really of vital importance, if you look back at the pandemic, I mean, the pandemic really showed that we need citizens who are able to think critically in order to distinguish reliable from misinformation, in order to really be able to understand the restrictive measures governments had to take in order to protect the health sector, for example. And somehow, as you mentioned, Andreas, a few minutes ago, you know, to organize themselves in the microcosm, so to say, and somehow be creative in coping with the situation. And I think citizenship education as a field, of course, in schools, but also in a non-formal sector, civil societies, needs to be reinforced. It needs to be better prioritized. If you look at the recent declarations coming from Ursula von der Leyen about the restart and relaunch of Europe, I mean, really citizenship education and the input of citizens into the project of Europe, for example, is really the great absentee. I mean, it's implicitly somehow everywhere and there, but still it needs to get a better explicit acknowledgement. And so that's why the Federal Agency of Civic Education at least is really trying to make that point, of course, in great solidarity and compliance with the Ministry of the Interior. And we are hoping to reach out to other European partners in the future. And on that note, I stop here. Thanks.
Thank you. No, it's an important point. So we had very often events where it turned out that, for instance, if you want to keep people on a certain place in the region, in the cities, they should also be enabled to take part in the democracy and also in the community. And of course, then a certain education for that and also certain schemes for that is very important. Karl-Ulrich Meyer, you were the next in the row. You have to unmute.
Hello, thank you. First of all, thank you for the honor of joining this group. And let me first say that I was greatly impressed by what Markus Kerber said. I think the precision and the vision of what you laid out is really encouraging. I almost hear already the new Koalitionsvereinbarungen, which you need to formulate for the next year, already well formulated out. So congratulations on this. I would like to raise one point. One of the positive consequences of population change, of demographic change, were shrinking cohort sizes, meaning that smaller cohorts of young people entered the labor market, and therefore it was easier to integrate both young East Germans and both young migrants. That really has been put into danger at the present time. What we are observing is a clear decline in the provision of apprenticeship places. We see a definite rise in those people who will probably not be able to get an apprenticeship this year. And then they will be, if they pick it up at all, they will be in competition with a much larger cohort of applicants next year. We know from other studies, we know from post-war studies, we know from unification, that in a way the loss of a qualified application, and apprenticeships relate to about 2/3 of German cohorts, is absolutely massive. And I must say, the federal government has responded with a 3,000 euro program. That has not been taken up well. Only 47% of the firms even know it. That probably has not worked. And that is one issue where we have to be clearly concerned. And it actually relates back to the issue of population diversity. I think the integration of non-EU migrants is still a huge issue. We just got the results of the PISA study, the math and science deficits. A country of Germany cannot really prosper with below average performances in math and natural sciences and be low behind even Russia and the Asian countries. And that also relates to COVID. Let me also make a remark on Arnstein Aassve. I think there is an issue with the Swedish welfare system. I think it has really come into doubt. As we have learned, mortality among migrants in Sweden, COVID mortality is really excessive. We don't quite know why. It used to be much below, it's the happy migrant thesis, much below in other causes, but not in regard to COVID. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Arnstein and Dr. Kerber, if you agree, we would first collect a few comments from the floor and then go on, that you can give a comment on it or respond to it. The next is Katja Hinze. Please take the floor.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me and also for these very inspiring statements and points. Thank you very much for that. I first also want to agree and thank you, Mr. Kerber, for the point of creating a positive narrative of the future. That's so much needed. And I'm so happy that, that a man like you coming from the ministry, also BMIs, that you say that and that you pointed out. So I really agree to that. I want to point out a program which we have in Germany. It's called Menschen stärken Menschen, Humans Strengthen Humans. It's a buddy program which is funded, government funded from the Ministry of Engagement, Familienministerium. It was created for the crisis in 2015 when all the refugees came to Germany, and all the volunteers were able and also were interested in welcoming the refugees and helping them by integration to Germany and all the systems and schools and educations and everything. Me talking here as the CEO of the Foundation Education, we are strengthening volunteers throughout Germany in kindergartens and schools. We have lots of millions of people who are working voluntarily in that field. And at the moment, and this is the interesting thing, we are a partner in this buddy program since 2015. We are matching children. 2015, always a child which came with a refugee background and a child which was already living here. Now these children which matched in the last years and became friends are helping in the second crisis, in the COVID crisis now, each other by helping you to learn, to see each other by digital learning platforms or everything. So this buddy program, funded and run by the government and by the partners from like us, is helping children, is helping volunteers, is helping all people in Germany to get throughout the crisis. And it's a very good program. I also can empfehlen is the German word, recommended to other European countries to actually start such a program, or even to the EU to have a program throughout the European countries. That would be so helpful in crisis. And I actually personally think we'll have every 2 or 3 or 5 years a next crisis. So far. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It's very, very nice also what you heard about the civic education, but also from you that there are initiatives. And for us, it's always very interesting in these meetings to have the research, policy, and the practitioner perspective. We can really learn from each other and help each other also. So thanks a lot. So the next one is Florian Roth. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, thanks very much. I find the question like how we can build systemic resilience, how we can make our societies, our political systems stronger and for the future very interesting. And I see like 3 main points. Like I think it's what Mr. Kerber said, like about political communication and narratives. It's a very important start to, I think, like the negative framing of policy options at the moment that we see, like that politicians tend to work a lot with like negative framings, worst case scenarios. And so this is research has shown that this works on a short term, but on a long term, we have to develop positive framings, positive narratives. And I think like one could be that this crisis could be turned and used for transformation processes to finally use momentum and overcome some of the problems that we face at the moment. And I think like we have some good examples. If you just think of like working condition in the meat industry, for example, this issue has been on the table for so many years. Finally, we have managed to get into that, or everyone now is talking about digitalization in schools. and finally we've got into that, and I think there's momentum there, and we can really use this momentum to build resilience and develop develop resilience there, and psychological resilience research really shows that having a narrative having a kind of a trust can really can help giving resilience to people on an individual level, that this is very powerful. And the other thing I really want to emphasize is that we can do a lot to strengthen civil society. The point that Arnstein made about social cohesion, I think it's very important. And I've been involved in research projects on the migration crisis and how civil society can be really empowered, how state agencies can empower these actors by reaching out to them, establishing structures for involving volunteers, for example, in disaster and crisis management. And I think we can learn a lot from these past experiences and also now use the experience from the current crisis, not to say this is like a one-time event. Other crises will come again in the future, and we have to really initiate institutional learning processes to improve our systems.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much. It's really important always to have also this perspective of the younger generation. Let me already invite you to the Berlin Demography days next year, where we talk about these intergenerational issues and how this what this means. Because indeed, you have a generation of a lot of chances and a lot of also higher wealth distribution than ever before. On the other side, of course, climate change and other things put you under stronger risk. We will come back to that because we already have a question from the floor in that regard. But let me turn the phone to Jani Arola. Please take the floor.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I'm Jani Arola, Professor of Sociology from University of Turku, Finland, and the Director of Finnish flagship for the inequalities interventions and the new welfare state. I think one of the issues where we're talking about, I mean, especially if we think about the population change and how that is linked to the future of Europe in general and societies in general, I think the focus has been, mostly this discussion focus has been in Europe has been either in migration and fertility. And if especially migration is hard politically in order to fix the population problems by that, then the other option is really the fertility. And if you look at the fertility and how policies can influence, or we think that the policies can actually influence fertility, I think that of course often the discussion goes to the family policies and the support targeted to the families, and that should have a positive influence on the fertility as well. But if you actually look at what is happening in the Nordics, as in Finland in general especially, you can see that actually fertility, despite of these extensive policies, the fertility is going down. And my colleague Marika Jalovaara has really convincingly argued that that the family policies is clearly not an issue. So what it is, that is actually partnerships. So it's actually the lack of partnerships that actually explains why fertility is going down. Now that the question is then why lack of partnership is then influencing this, is simply that there are growing proportion of the population, especially low-educated men, who actually never partner. They are never in the long-term partnerships at all. And this, of course, have a detrimental effects on the fertility in general on the long run. Now, if you think about what COVID now does, I mean, of course, we can think about the educational system as a partnership market, and then, of course, employment as well as having a similar role. And of course, both of these both of these aspects that would increase fertility to increase in partnerships is actually now going down. So I think this is, if we think about the policy responses to how COVID changes population and the fertility, we should think how we influence these aspects and how we actually make the partnerships also happen in the future, when they're probably chances of people meeting each other in person would be probably lower than for a long time. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's it.
Thanks a lot. This again puts a little bit also the focus again to the microsociology issues, how we can make more partnerships possible and encourage and empower people to that. The next one is Jana Hainsworth from Eurochild. Please take the floor, Jana.
Yeah, thank you, Andreas. Very interesting debate. So I'm coming into this from the perspective of a European level network of NGOs promoting the rights of children. So I very much appreciate the aspiration to have a optimistic, long-term narrative, which is values-driven, that moves beyond facts, numbers, economics. And I think really children offer that hope for the future. We have seen such an amazing mobilization of children and young people with regard to the climate crisis, but much, much broader than the climate crisis. And the potential of children being engaged at local, community, even national level is huge. And we have children directly involved in organizing events, and there is such a huge potential, which is also transformative in our education systems, in healthcare, in community development. And I think that that's just a huge source of reason to be optimistic and energy. Where that falls down, I think there was a point about this generation being the unluckiest in a long time. And when we look at the impact of the pandemic, it has undoubtedly not created inequality, but entrenched inequality. And the numbers of those children that were already heavily disadvantaged before the crisis are the ones that are suffering most in the midst of this crisis, both in terms of educational outcomes, but also exposure to violence, the opportunities to learn digitally, all of these things. And this is why the kind of intention of our leaders today must be directed at tackling long-term inequalities in our society. And the best way of doing that is by really investing and transforming our education, early childhood systems. And just to refer to the childcare area, because it is often put up there as being a panacea, it creates gender equality, it helps tackle disadvantage. It doesn't in and of itself. So just investing in universal childcare is not in and of itself the solution. Of course, we want more and better quality childcare opportunities for young children, but it's also about how you build societies which is inclusive and supportive of all families with young children, because even with childcare places available, there will be communities, particularly those of other cultural backgrounds, don't want to send children to childcare, and those childcare places are often not very inviting or very accommodating of difference. So it's for us very much about early childhood development in a broader sense, how we're supporting families with young children and having a more comprehensive and inclusive approach. Of course, we need to invest in early years, but let's think about it in a holistic way, which is why we're developing a Eurochild campaign on early childhood development more broadly, recognizing the importance of those first years, but thinking of it in an ecosystem, not just as a one service approach. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really an important statement. And I think it also concurs a little bit what Arnstein mentioned in the beginning on the role of education. So perhaps we collect a few more statements from the floor, and then I would ask the two panelists to give a first reaction, and then we would ask also, take some questions from the general audience into that picture. So the next one is Emilia Del Bono, please.
Hi, thank you for inviting me today. I'm sort of stay with the education theme actually, which is what I wanted to talk about. I'm the director of the SRC Centre, a UK research centre on microsocial change, which is mainly interested in understanding social inequalities. My reflections really, I mean, there are many different points that the speakers so far have raised. I want to go back perhaps to the concept of resilience that has been mentioned as being key to the discussion today. And I guess I'm an economist. I'm not a psychologist. I don't, perhaps understand entirely how to measure resilience and what basically it implies. But my understanding is that the ability to kind of respond to adversity, to adverse events or negative events. And that makes me think that in order to really sort of get an understanding of it, a grip on what it is and how we can perhaps, cultivate it or direct our resources towards it. I think, I would agree with the comments made by the previous speaker that we need to sort of focus a lot more our attention on the education, but in a very broad sense. I think, at the moment we focus a lot on the development of certain type of skills, in particular cognitive skills that are, of course, of values for the development of children and in the labor market for understanding productivity and so on and so forth. But there is actually quite a lot that we still don't understand about the development of different types, if you want, of non-cognitive skills. And I think if we were able to think of education in a much broader sense, to encompass different type of skills, and also make the effort to measure different type of skills much more routinely than perhaps is done today, we will get a better understanding of what resilience, however we measure, is related to in terms of underlying traits, and also how these traits can be somewhat cultivated, encouraged from perhaps a very younger age. I mean, the generation of children that are currently in education are going to have to deal with many challenges. I mean, the challenges that in the long term COVID will generate, the challenges of climate change and so on and so forth. So to nurture different aspects of their development, and in particular some of their non-cognitive skills will be of very great value. At the moment, I'm talking to this as an applied researcher. We often get an idea of these non-cognitive skills from very specific surveys, often done on a non-representative sample of the population. And I think, a general kind of understanding that we actually need to get a much broader look at these aspects of the development of an individual, of a human being, would be very, very welcome also in the policy discourse, if we are to take this, this agenda or the importance of things like resilience very seriously. So this would be my sort of, appeal to sort of have a general generally more attention to these aspects.
Thanks a lot, Jamie. You raised many important points. One of the persons which I know who work a lot also on this, what you mentioned, inequality issues, but also on education, is Fabrizio Bernardi. And luckily, he's just queuing up as the next. Fabrizio, let me give you the floor. Of course, I didn't want to impose any kind of answer to you or a question to you.
No, thank you, Andreas. Actually, you anticipate I see that I'm very... there's no surprise if I have to speak. But in any case, I'm Fabrizio Bernardi. I'm professor of sociology at the European University Institute. So I would like to make 2 points, also maybe bringing a bit of a South European perspective into the debate. And the first point has to see with the rising level of inequality related to the issues of cohesion and also population challenges. And I agree that having different narratives is certainly important, but on the other hand, what we are seeing, also accentuated by the COVID crisis, of course, does also reflect some structural changes that have taken place over the decades, and we know that one of them has been the rising level of inequality. And so I think that we also need to think about some type of structural reforms if we believe that there is an underlying engine for these populist movements that are regaining momentum related to the COVID. And it's not only rising inequality, but also rising inequality linked to staggering mobility chances that creates this type of unhappiness, unsatisfactions that also, I think, creates a psychological basis to adhere to whatever movement is offered in a given moment. Related to this, it is also interesting, I think, I add this, that what we have seen with the COVID, at least in Italy and Spain that I know, that in principle, demand for more education, for more public health, and even support to measures like basic income have increased over the COVID crisis. So I just want to say that maybe there is also a momentum for thinking a more redistributive type of policies, and that maybe just 1 year ago were unconceivable. The support to minimal income was very low, for instance, in Italy, and out of the crisis due to COVID, people have become more supportive of these measures. And the second point is related to education. And I certainly agree that education is fundamental, and it also offers to those who have educations tools to be resilient. On the other hand, and thinking really about policy, I have sometimes the impression that we charge education with too many hopes and too many responsibilities, education and schools. So education is the way to create social mobility, education is the way to create good citizens, education is the way to create employable citizens. On the other hand, I think that education is not enough. And also, it's not enough if then there are no good jobs, for instance, for those we educate. And so, and also, I think that's basically what I want to say, that I think we should have a broader view. Education is not the single leverage we should use if we really want to create more cohesions and more well-being in the population. So it should simply be a part, in my view, but this is more like a statement thinking about a more equal society. Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot. So crisis is somehow also a chance, and I can agree more to that. Just think about homeworking was a no-go last year. This year it's the standard. And this of course has impacts on how much time you can spend at home, how much time you can spend in your partnership and so on, and with your children. And I think this is, I also would agree with you. We have also to see also the positive signs, but not overload educational systems. So there's the last question on the floor from Gösta Esping Andersen. Gösta, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. I would like to get at one issue that I think has been touched upon, but hasn't become centrally focused in the debate so far, which is the possible social polarization effects that are being augmented and increased and intensified by the COVID-19 crisis. What we demographers often talk about is the social gradient of fertility, of divorce, and so forth and so on. What we mean by that is that the socioeconomic distribution or the profile, socioeconomic profile differs across the social classes in society. What we're seeing is a reinforcement of a trend of suboptimal family demographic outcomes that are increasingly being concentrated at the lower end of the socioeconomic totem pole, and to a much less degree at the top. In contrast, in fact, at the top is doing very well, demographically speaking. Of course, the crisis now, the COVID crisis, is in terms of employment prospects and uncertainty, not only economic uncertainty, but vulnerability more generally, is very much concentrated in the lower end of the society. Now, that means in terms of fertility, in terms of partnering, partnership stability, that you will have more uncertainty translating into more unstable partnerships, possibly also, as was discussed earlier, a less inclination towards partnering to begin with. It will also translate almost certainly into lower fertility, having fewer children than you actually desire to have. That is a suboptimal family life profile that is increasingly concentrated at the lower end of society. Professors in universities, like most of us, we don't have a lot to fear. So we don't have this kind of anxiety-driven translation into the demographic outcomes that is the case among people who fear that their jobs are not just lost now, but maybe forever, or at least for a long, long, long time in the future. And I think what we have to really policy-wise take into consideration is this rising polarization in our populations that is being catapulted and accelerated by the COVID crisis to an extent that we had not anticipated just 1 year ago. And I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot. It's an important intervention. I guess we have really to see, even if it's a very complex phenomena, we have really to see social inequality, and here also at the lower end of the social stratification, population diversity, which is increasing, and political stability somehow in a connection, which is not an easy business, but I think that's actually the task of the future. But a very, very important intervention that leads me a bit to the first question from the floor. Which was raised by, he's thinking, it was answered. So in the meantime, that's good. Yes, one question from someone who asks, more state, less market, more resilience, less dependence. It goes a bit into that direction. Then other question which we get from our floor is a question for Arnstein Aassve. This question comes from Paul Dijkstra from Rotterdam. Resilience seemed a very psychological concept. How do you envision influencing such a trait through public policy? Arnstein, would you like to answer to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think resilience, so the way I would think about it is, on one hand, how you would think about making people more resilient. One possibility, education here is mentioned. I certainly agree with Fabrizio Bernardi that education might not be the only way. Josta points out the idea that the COVID is hurting those at the bottom of the distribution, income distribution, or social class distribution, if you like, more than us that are much higher up. I think one thing to bring in here is that, and which hasn't been mentioned much, is how fast technological change and how fast our societies are changing. And in many respects, COVID is kind of an additional on top shock to that. In a week, suddenly we were all able to use Zoom and all meetings done online, and tech firms have been benefiting incredibly, and which kind of suggests that those who are good or well-resourced in terms of technology, they're going to come out of this reasonably well. Which brings me to the point about education. I think one of the things you're going to see from the COVID, but what's in any case happening, is that you do a certain education, a certain profession, and suddenly you're out of a job. Your profession is in decline. You don't find a job, and if you have low education, you have education but not very high, you're going to find it very difficult to to find your way in societies. So when we talk about education, one policy measure that should be thought about much more is actually adult education. So not only having education for many more at young adulthood, but for those people who need to retrain, who end up in a bad situation, either because of technological change or because of the COVID, they need to be able to, or have the opportunity to retrain and get back on track. And this is one example of how society, through policies, can help people being resilient. Then I think that there are other measures that can be done in terms of childhood education that was mentioned by several here. If I may, just one more minute, a response to Jana Hainsworth. I take your point about childcare not being that's not the only thing that matters, and it has. But if you look to south of Europe and several other European countries, universal childcare is just, you're just very far away from it. Then you can discuss the curriculum and so on. And I also want to point out that, in some countries, inequality runs through family resources. So if you don't have universal childcare or child school, basically those with a lot of family resources, they're going to bring up their children very nice, very well, no problem. Those with few family resources, they're going to stay stuck in terms of life chances.
Staatssekretär Kerber, would you like to directly respond, or should we take another 2 questions from the floor?
No, I think it's a very, if I may.
Sure.
It's a very central point to talk about resilience. And I do have to admit, I'm married to a psychologist, so I'm slightly biased to certain concepts of resilience. But if we remind ourselves, first of all, that resilience is a psychological term for all intents and purposes. They created it and they brought it into the world of science. And I think if we re-secure ourselves, what resilience is all about, it's about making a human being able to cope with uncertainty, with ambiguity, with ambivalence, and to then redefine ambiguity, uncertainty, unexpectedness, surprises, pitfalls of life as the normality. Then we know what kind of mountain we have to climb. And I cannot overestimate my deep belief that the last 3 decades, the Western societies thought we had it. No more uncertainty, no more ambiguity, no more ambivalence. We had a model. It had won in 1989 and 1990. Communism was overcome. The whole world would adapt it. And guess what? Go into the hammock, go into autopilot, and we shall all be happy. 2 events and changed all that. And Arnstein is right. It was the financial crisis, but it was also the migration crisis. Not the arrival of the people, but the unpreparedness, that the sheer passion and determination that these poor people brought to into our comfort zone. That has changed, and I hate to say that has created a lot of insecurity in the minds of people in Europe. How much more is there to come? Can we cope with it? Karl Ulrich Meyer spoke about the problem that non-EU young people find it very difficult to integrate themselves into the expectations that our system has towards them when it comes to apprenticeship and educating yourself. And all this shows what Florian Roth had mentioned. We're in a huge and very intense time of transformation. We seem to know that what used to be the normality is no longer the normality, but we have no idea what the new normal will be. And if there is a new normal, or if there's uncertainty, ambivalence, ambiguity, these thousands of shades of gray, there is no black and no white any longer. Whether this is now permanent or whether we have something to look forward to. And I got one comment on the chat, if I interpreted it right, saying, how can I dare to talk about positive narratives when there is climate change. I'm not against the climate change narrative. I just think it's not enough to get people out of the bed in the morning and to get them out of the bed in a very optimistic way. And this being a demographic forum, I'm intrigued and somewhat depressed that I will not be old enough when the year 2050 arrives, because according to all the population research that I know, something historic will happen around 2050. World population will come to a standstill. For me as an economist, that is almost unthinkable, because growth, one of the key paradigms in our head, growth, economic growth is related to population growth. More people will need more energy, more food, more cars, more everything. So we have to build a machine that caters for the growth. It's called the modern economy. But if in 2050, not only the climate will be stabilized, but also world population, this will be a totally different society, and it could be a very positive one, because it will be a sustainable, in itself sustained because no longer growing society. And I think that is the bridge. The resilience is the bridge. And I agree with Professor Bernardi. Education in terms of schools and curricula is not enough, but education in a broader sense, that we teach people to cope with this ambiguity for a little longer, because there's something at the end of the tunnel that they can be, if they're young enough, and Mrs. Hainsworth is right, it's the young people and the children who have to bear the torch forward. They will be, if they're 10 years old today, they will be 40 when they reach 2050. So they have all the reason to be resilient, and then have probably another 30, 40, 50 years to live in a totally different world that we cannot even imagine today.
Mm-hmm. I also think so. It's really a very important points which you raised. I'm not married to a psychologist. I'm a historian by training, and you see in history often periods of time where people are overwhelmed by complexity, and then they start to get uncertain, and then they start to get into a mood which often leads them to revolutions or other events. Yeah. And I think we are maybe at such a mark of in time where we have to reframe it. I would like to get back to this narrative. I see from the comments that many people were more skeptic on this positive narrative. I think it's still important to make clear that we are part of a development which we still have in hands. Let me give you one example. We talk a lot about population diversity, and very often the discourse since the migration crisis goes in the wrong direction. Population diversity is seen as mainly the ethnic diversity issue, which is not true. Every one of us, wherever you live, rural, big cities, metropolitan areas, is part of this diversity. And the important thing is to understand you're part of it and you can create it. It's not that we talk only about a certain fragmentation of the population. So I think the narratives are very important, and I can really only strongly underline that. Arnstein, would you like to directly interact with the State Secretary? You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I take the last point you said. I mean, I do agree with the issues about the narratives. I think that the one issue that has been problematic is that politics has become a lot about identity politics. So and that for good reasons, in the sense that you may want to do identity politics in order to make sure that groups in societies that are let's say discriminated against stops being discriminated against, and so on. But I do also think that the identity politics has sort of created polarization, and in this sort of competition that happens between, let's say, interest groups and so on, it becomes a lot easier to focus on negative narratives in order to sort of compete on negative narratives, so to speak. And then I totally agree with this idea that one role for politicians is really to try to steer or shift the discourse on some more long-term perspectives and try to focus more on the, let's say, the bigger common topics and that we can all agree on. And I also think that, you know, climate change can be made with a positive slant through technology, through innovation, and so on. Now, you mentioned growth, though. It might be true that population growth is going to stabilize. On the other hand, you know, we are not alone in Europe. There are many actors outside us where certainly economic growth is going to carry on, and which is the main aim for many of those. I wouldn't be so optimistic that the paradigm of growth is going to finish very soon. But I think we need to shift the paradigm to bring in the sustainable growth. And there, I think we can have a role to play, both as the scientists and politicians together.
Maybe I can display one question from the audience also, which comes from Nico van Nimwegen, who asked for redefine whether we should think about social resilience then. So it might be fit a little bit to what you just said, Ani, about that we need new paradigms. And so the question is then, do we have to define resilience not as an individual task, but more as a social task, and also social resilience, and stressing that having resources is actually key to cope with crisis?
I mean, I gave one example for how policy could be thought about as an institutional aspect to help resilience, and but it's a big job. It really needs a long-term commitment to make societies more resilient, and perhaps European countries in particular more resilient. I think that there is going to be adaptation there. You know, you can think about the US, for instance, where suppose you impose the US labor market onto a European country, for instance, you know, people are going to feel lost because the labor market is so dynamic and people move, and that's the nature of it. But there, you know, people are used to it. They have adapted to the fact that this is the name of the game. This is how society is. And people become resilient because this is the expectation. I think there has to be a long-term idea about how to, and I certainly don't propose an American-style labor market at all, but there needs to be step-by-step ways to think about how societies and how the state can help people becoming more resilient. And there are a whole range of factors there. And I think one needs to think about the whole package in order to help making countries go that way.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot. My colleague, thanks a lot for this important and very well taken response. We talked or touched during this seminar more than once the COVID-19, and my colleague just alerted me that there's a person in the room who he left. Okay, he was in the room. Lothar Wieler, the president of the Robert Koch Institute, but it seems he went away again. Okay, so he's still around and could take the floor now. Okay, so sorry, this was a misinformation, but at least you see that this topic is also highly interesting and of highly relevance also for the leading epidemiologists, because really we have also to see the social backgrounds of the current pandemic. We have still a few minutes of time, and I would like to bring in at least one person into the floor, which is Rebecca Sear from the London School of Health and Hygiene Medicine. Rebecca, please take the floor.
very much, Andreas. Thank you very much for this invitation. We academics in the UK are very keen to maintain conversations, collaborations and partnerships with our European colleagues. So thank you very much for this invitation. In relation to the topic of this panel, I would like to talk about inequality again. I think that levelling inequality is what policy should focus on in order to improve demographic outcomes and societal outcomes, reducing mortality, supporting people to have the number of children that they want. Populism seems to have come out of inequality. So policy needs to focus on levelling inequalities. And the way to do that is to focus on changing the environment, the circumstances that people are in. I have some concerns about policies which focus on changing the individual, because how individuals behave is a function of their environment. If we reduce poverty, if we provide universal childcare to give every child the same start in life, these are things which are likely to be effective at reducing inequalities. Policies which focus on the individual may not work, certainly if they don't take into account the fact that the environment that we're in changes the way that we think. So in health inequalities, there's a lot of research showing that in disadvantaged environments, cognition, the way people think, the way people behave is just different, because different behaviors are more strategic in different environments. So I think for reducing inequalities, we really need to focus on changing the environment rather than the individual as the priority. The sociologist Arlene Geronimus calls this Jedi public health, and I think that's a great name for a great concept.
Thanks a lot. This brings again also the health dimensions into the picture, public health dimension. Okay, and then we have as a last voice, Trude Lappegaard from Norway. Please take the floor.
Thank you. I have a question for Arnstein. You have talked a bit about it already, but it's about then the consequences and the influence of policies for the recovery after COVID-19. So you mentioned that policy is important for welfare, and that it is. And we had liked here in the Nordic countries, like the idea that policies also is important for fertility and family formation. But the last 10 years have shown that that's not enough. And the whole fertility landscape of Europe have changed these years. But after, after then COVID-19, then what? What do you think will the importance then of policies, not just for the welfare, but also for young people to feel they have then the security enough to set a family and have children? Then policy, in fact, do again or do have an importance? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think again, I feel that there are short-run policies that one needs to think about, but never forget the more long-term policies. And the short-term policies, yeah, what exactly they should be. What I think here is for sure an awareness that there are certain, the young generation is going to suffer potentially much more than before. I mentioned this phrase, unluckiest generation who experienced, were young, both under the economic recession in 2008 and the years following, but also now with the COVID, when they are starting their family life and starting to think about having children and so on. So I think policies, short-term policies, need to, at the very least, have keep a good eye on how they fare and how they are doing. I also think that the COVID is accelerating things that were already in motion, so that there are certain occupations that are going to suffer a lot more than other. It's related to educational level. And I think that the policies the policymakers, let's say, they need to keep a close eye to what are the winning occupations here and what are the losing out occupations, and be careful to help those who are now not only losing the job, they might find it very difficult to find a job in the industry or the occupation that they were. But then there is the longer run, and there I think there is long run perspectives needs to be maintained, and there I would go back to policies that relate to early childhood education, but also the resilience that comes through giving the opportunity to retrain in case you lose your job. And by the end of the day, I take the point about partnership, which is an important one. But by the end of the day, for fertility and child planning, childbearing, you need predictability, you need stability. And this has been raised now a lot, that in this COVID times and the technological change that we've seen, there is more uncertainty. And that is always difficult for those who want to plan a family. So I still come back to the point of having long-term stable policies, and thinking about those who are losing out the most during COVID, but also over the last decade.
Thanks a lot, Arnie, for this already conclusive remark. Staatssekretär Kerber, would you also add something on the policy perspective, from the policy perspective, or say it with Karl-Ulrich Meyer for the next coalition treaty from this debate?
I mean, since we're running out of time a little bit, I just like to say that actually three things. Firstly, I as a civil servant, I couldn't do my job without scientific support. It's more than ever needed. We need to prove what we're doing. We need to underline it and underpin it with scientific and empirically validated stuff. Second point, please try as Popperian as you can, try and challenge hypotheses, don't try to verify them. And thirdly, with the great words of Fleetwood Mac, don't stop thinking about tomorrow. That's really, there's a lot of truth in it. Today deviates us always, and yesterday deviates us always from what is really important, and that is tomorrow. We can change what happens tomorrow if we are optimistic. That's on a very philosophical basis. Otherwise, you cannot survive inside a government if you're not optimistic.
That's a great statement at the end, because let's think a bit about tomorrow, and thanks a lot for all your contributions. It was really a very rich debate, and we got a lot of, I think we never got before, so many comments in the chat, in the Q&A session. It's not lost, to be frank. We have, of course, only 90 minutes. It was clear that we cannot cover all of that. We will write a policy event review on that so that you can reread. Of course, it will also be performed then in YouTube. Actually, I see a full range of a research program, but also a full range of a program where researchers can communicate with people from the policy sector and from NGOs. So I see also a program for Population Europe, to be frank, to do a lot in the next years to follow up on that. So I can only say thanks a lot to all of you, to Staatssekretär Kerber that you joined us today, to Arnstein that you joined the panel, to all the eminent speakers from all over Europe who joined us today, to all the people in the audience who gave so many good questions. And I think we are on the start, not at the end, and that's great. In that regard, have a great future, have a great tomorrow, and a nice Christmas, and thanks a lot for joining us.